what I want to do is present, kind of make a case and ask a question. The question being, how does Genesis function for you? I would love to do survey. I'd love to, if we were on retreat, we could spend a half an hour asking each other, how has Genesis been as a source of something for you, either frustration, annoyance, despair, or power, motivation, and understanding, or anywhere in between those two things. So the the let me pull up. I'm gonna start sharing this PowerPoint if I can find the thing, and then to it's always sharing a PowerPoint and tracking folks in Zoom is always a bit of a challenge. I think it's kind of like you can do one or the other, but you can't do both. There we are. So the idea is ask the question for us all: in what way can Genesis be a grounding resource for ministries, for those who are engaged in ministries of creation care, like most of us here are? And so that's the question I want to frame it. So what I'm kind of saying is, we'll be talking about Genesis, but what I really want us talking about is creation care ministry. And so for people of faith who are seeking healing, reconciliation with all things, that's describing us. Yes. How can these chapters, these early chapters, especially like 1 through 11 of Genesis, but the whole book, because we don't want to fragment the book out, which has been part of the problem with Genesis in the first place, how can these chapters empower us? How can they provide confidence and secure hope? And it would be a related question to say, is Genesis anything in it for you, something you would name as a source of confidence or secure hope? And so another way to frame it is, what can these chapters do for us? What power can they have? Is sort of the driving question of the evening. I want to start this with this quote from Metro John of Pergamon. Sometimes that's how Metropolitan John. And this is something that he has said that I think is rather profound. Our ecological crisis is due not so much to a wrong ethic as to a bad ethos. And we'll sort those two out here in a second. It is a cultural problem. We are all born priests. And unless we remain so throughout our lives, we are bound to suffer the ecological consequences we are now experiencing. Now, we could spend the rest of this hour unpacking that. But the base question I want to ask first is, what's the difference between an ethic and an ethos? Anybody want to raise their hand on that one? The difference between an ethic and an ethos. Seeing none, we'll move on. An ethic would be, the laws are to manage whaling, right? And so it's a be bad ethic to overharvest or to hunt whales beyond what you're supposed to. That's an ethic. Breaking those laws or somehow unfairly violating the whale hunt would be a bad ethic. The ethos is, what is a whale? What is a whale's value? How do we view such a creature? What's our relationship to it? So ethos is the bigger cultural underlying worldview that creates ethics. And so what John is, he is saying to us is, it's not just ethics. We're not going to solve this by rules and regulations, by technology, by any of the numerous solutions being proposed out there, because what we have is a cultural problem. It's ethos. We are not rightly related to the world. Our relationship to that which is around us, and in what we would name probably in this group as kindred, is not named as kindred in our culture. And to which every one of us would claim as our born birthright, and then claim that for the duration of our lives. That's the ethos that he proposes as a solution to the ecological crisis. Very, very religious outlook, right? Very orthodox, for that matter, but not bad for Episcopalians and others who are familiar with priesthood, and not bad for Baptists either, who are very clear on the priesthood of all believers. So he's saying we need to claim that. Now, behind that ethos is a relationship question. And so I just got three graphic representations of potential relationship of between us as humans and the rest of the web of life. One being fellowship, a ecocentric view, there of which we are one among many. We are present, but not in a special way. One is of stewardship, where we are present in a special way. And we are, in fact, responsible. And one might say stewardship might carry an implication of ownership. It puts us at the top of a pyramid. And I wonder if there's, and I'm just proposing this third one called priesthood, which does allow us to remain in a special place, but it's not at the top of anything. Now, this is a very fundamental question. It's a very spiritual question. And I think following Bishop John, that it lies at the center of our work. And so what I guess I'm saying, what I want to say then is, this is the kind of question we want to bring to Genesis. We want it to help us name our relationship to the world. What we don't want to do is ask these kind of questions of Genesis. Where did everything come from? Why did God create the world? Why are we here? What's the origin of evil? Is evolution correct, or the Big Bang? Does it disagree with Genesis? Does Genesis tell us how the world began? Is the Bible inerrant? Do we have to compete between what the Bible says and what science says? All of those questions, number one, are not helpful, and number two, Genesis is not interested in any of them. The answers are not there. It doesn't care about them. It's not trying to answer them. Those aren't Genesis questions. And so it's not helpful to distract with these questions, which I would guess propose that much of our culture actually is distracted by when it comes to assessing Genesis and its value. And it may be what you grew up with, and you didn't like the answers, and therefore you dismiss Genesis as trouble, rather than as life-giving faith-forming power. What we want Genesis to help us do is answer these kind of questions. What is our right relationship to creation? By what values can we live and serve? How do we name our role and place? Against what do we struggle? What is broken, either about us or about the world or about society or anything else? Those questions Genesis is very interested in. And those are critical questions to our ministries. Having those answers solidly in our hearts would indeed empower us to take stands and to stand in those stands, or to have faith, or to have courage, or to have hope. So I'm just trying to frame up, what do we need to do with Genesis? So let's begin then with the beginning. First off, I think we should rightly name what these sources are for us. Genesis chapter 1 is pretty much a hymn. It's a great liturgy. It's not a report. It's not history. It's not science. It's not a legal document. It is basically a poem. It's music. And so you would ask about it, and I even argue, and I'm not sure how that would stand, and if Colin were here, I'd be curious about his response, being an Old Testament professor guy. I want to say Genesis chapter 1 actually isn't about creation. It's not a hymn about creation. It's actually a hymn about Sabbath. And because Sabbath takes up all of creation, creation is very present in the hymn. But the crescendo and the climax of the hymn is Sabbath. And so, okay, that's good. Because Sabbath is one of those things that could ground our lives if we would let it. Genesis 2 through 3 is a great story. Using the word rightly, it's a great mythology. It's one of those stories where you might say, you guys probably have heard it, I don't know if this ever really happened, but I know it's true. That kind of description of the power of myth and how that works. So it is a story about humans. Actually, it is not either an account of creation. It assumes basically the creation, it really just kind of almost skips past it and moves straight into the fact that there was no one to till the earth, and therefore the waters were limited in what they were doing. So anyway, so this is just to frame a little bit about what we're working with. So there's a typo in there. But we can start with this. The place Genesis begins is in the beginning, when God began to create. In the beginning, God. This we can own for ourselves, to say the world is about God. It's full of God. It's holy. It's of God. It is of God's concern. The world is theological. And the import of that for us, number one, is to have the assurance and the confidence to say we really can have, our faith says to us that all creation is full of God. We don't need we don't need the indigenous traditions to tell us that. We already have that. We just need to claim it. And then this quote by Wendell Berry, where he says, "Our destruction of nature is not just bad stewardship or stupid economics," even though it is both those things, right? We can make those arguments. We've heard those arguments. Everyone knows them. It is stupid economics, the destruction of our very resource, our very ground of an economy. Or a betrayal of family responsibility by not taking care of the next generation or the next or to the seventh generation. It is all of those things. But he says it's not just those things. It's the most horrid blasphemy. And the word blasphemy lends a whole nother level to the conversation, to the issue, to the depth of the sin. Because it implies that it is a sacrilege. It is not just against our own selves, it is against God. That there is a greater and higher violation going on than just our own societies and our own futures. It is a violation of holiness and sacredness and something much larger than ourselves. This comes from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God began to create, is the way some translate that. So we need to claim that for ourselves and own that in our hearts, and seek to establish that in our own faith, that the holiness of all things is not something we need to borrow from anybody else. We have it. Now I'm going to run this very quickly. This is the days of creation in Genesis chapter 1, and this is the way the hymn is built. And it's kind of helpful to recognize something about the way the hymn is built. So you'll just very quickly review. In day 1, let there be light. In day 2, God separated the firmament from above to below, basically setting in the worldview, in that ancient worldview, that second day, the sky, which is the firmament above, and the waters below were separated out. Before, it was just water, the waters of chaos. And so God is ordering things. And what you'll notice, and then the third day, the dry lands appear, and is filled with vegetation. Now, this column to the left, what you'll notice about it is that these are spaces and places. These are the heavens. These are the skies and the oceans and the waters. And this is the land. And vegetation is part of the landscape, basically. You could say that this is, and the way this is, where I'm headed with this is a frame of an ancient temple. This is the temple structure. And notice the corresponding days. So 1, 2, 3, you have the heavens, you have the skies and the waters, and you have the land. On days 4 and 5, 6, you have lights, which go in the heavens. You have, in day 5, you have the creation of aviary life, of birds and stuff that belong to the firmament above, and you have the creation of marine life, which belong to the waters below. And day 6, you have the creation of the land, which was separated out, and then you fill it with inhabitants, land animals, humans, and the blessings of food for all. So the sequence of the hymn is you create the spaces and then you fill them. You create the form and then you fill them. So Genesis 1 and 2 was the earth was formless and void. It had no structure and it was empty. Now we have structure and we fill it. And they say this is a sort of the account probably that came out of the priestly community, and they would recognize this as a description of the earth as God's temple. And the Holy of Holies in that temple is what happened on day 7, where creation is completed. And on the 7th day, creation was not completed on day 6. It was completed on day 7. And on day 7 was the establishment of Sabbath. And so what this structural hymn does in Genesis 1 is creates the world and places right in the Holy of Holies of the world the Sabbath. And that's the music that is being played here. So let's see. I'm looking for a way to make my here we go. Okay, let's see. Where are we? We're here. Okay, I'm kind of looking at time a little bit. Okay, so this is the slide where I want to also call out a few things about these days. That's really important. Let's see. We'll move on. Let's move on. All right. Now I'm going to skip down to the blessing of the human animal and the giving of domain, and then we're going to backfill it real quick. So in this story of creation on day 6, with both animals and humankind, you need to notice a couple of things about that. Number one, humankind is not the pinnacle of the creation story in Genesis 1. Sabbath is. One of the ways we know that is humankind was not given a day of their own. We share that day with the creation of animals and their blessing, all on the same day. But in the midst of that day, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And so God did create humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, this is the challenging text for many of us. The dominion text. And it begs an enormous question for us. Let us make humankind in our image. What is that? What is it that we are bearing? This thing called the image of God. Just how are we to image God, and where? And the challenge with Genesis is we need to resist the temptation to go outside of this chapter, or of the book at least, to define that. The idea of image and humankind is created in the image of God is actually not very established in the Old Testament. It's only mentioned twice, and it's not a huge big deal. I think it became more of a big deal probably among the Greeks and those who speculate about, how are humans different than other, how are we better than, is the way it turned out to be, I suppose. That's not what is here. We need to ask, in this chapter, what is the image of God? And by the way, a little side line here on the way this creation works. Notice that they're domesticated animals already created. Well, I guess you'd have to back up. Domesticated animals were created before there was a human being to domesticate them. I find that kind of interesting, that the cattle existed, and cattle are separated from wild animals, but they both existed before humankind was ever made. And that was also true actually in chapter 2. But anyway, all right. So what I want to do with this, to spend the rest of the time, in just a couple of minutes, I guess, really, is to say this. I think we should claim the image of God, and even the dominion passage. Because it's proving to be true that this domain of the earth is something the human animal has tremendous influence over. And dominion isn't to be read as overpowering. I think it's meant to be read as, number one, you could say domain. We have domainness. We are to image God within this domain. For the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the cattle and over the wild animals of the earth and every creeping thing. And now, so it begs the question, well, then what is the image of God? And that's where I want to go from here. What is the image of God in Genesis? One thing we note in this creation story is that God's image in the creation story of this chapter is one of mutuality. When God created the spaces and then started to fill them with inhabitants, those inhabitants were given creative roles. The sun and the moon were given rule. The waters were called to bring forth creatures. The earth was called to bring forth creatures. And so God is not singularly owning creation. God is inviting the participation of the inhabitants, basically the spaces, to fill their own the spaces to fill their own with their own inhabitants. The earth and the seas are being invited to be co-creators, to join in the God role of creation. Notice also male and female. So in male and female he made them. Let us make them in our image. Male and female he made them. It wasn't the male only, which you would find in other ancient Near Eastern worldviews, that those who bear the image of God would be the king, is the one who bears the image of God. In Genesis, it's all human beings, male and female. So the starkness of that contrast is something that I guess that we should notice. That also then that humans are not the pinnacle of creation. They could have written it that way. It does not read that way. We are servants of the purpose. We're not its benefactors. There actually are no heroes in the creation stories, which you would find in other creation myths, except unless it's the Sabbath, which is the hero of the creation story, perhaps. And the original blessing was not given just to the king. It wasn't given just to the one race of humans, which is also often common. They were not even mediated through a king, nor a superior gender, nor a race. There it is complete. It's remarkably flat. The source of blessing and the source of creation in this creation story. So God shares God's domain, sharing creation with earth and seas, giving domain over to the humans to bless. That means that if we're imaging God in the world, we image that sharing and that mutuality and that egalitarian way of being. Let's see. God's image is one of blessing. We could ask, if we're imaging God in the world, what was God doing? God was blessing. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. To all the creatures, to the humans, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. All green things are given to food to not just humans, to all animals. All green things are given to food for all animals as well. So, and we should read dominion as a blessing. It's not a curse. We are just, it's our misuse of it is the curse. Okay, so, and then God's image is of Sabbath, which is not rest and recovery for more work, but actually it's the basis of trust and contentment. Sabbath rules the week. That's why there's 7 days of creation, because Sabbath. Sabbath is something not only taken, it's given, and it's grounded in all creation. It's not just a cult of Israel. All right, we're at 8:12, so I'm going to, there we are. I wasn't even forwarding this thing I was supposed to here. Let's see. So this is what being made in the image of God I want to propose from this first chapter is we carry and we have conviction about holiness. We appreciate the presence of God in all because that is our founding story, that God is present to all. We as bearers of the image of God, we give ourselves to mutuality. We recognize that everything has a God-given place. As that bearer of image, we give ourselves to blessing and serve the flourishing of all life. That is our God-given role, which will be reaffirmed in the second chapter in tilling and keeping and our role in the garden. That's the same thing. We're bearing the image of God into the world. And then Sabbath and the conviction that life is more than work and acquisition. And every creature is given Sabbath, not just human beings. And that gets bore out throughout the law and in the life of Israel. We can see that borne out. All right, so I'm going to stop with that because I'm losing my voice and we're running out of time. So my apologies for how rough that might be. The idea would be to turn that into a curriculum, turn that into a retreat, turn that into something that would engage groups of people into reviewing, revisiting how Genesis might function in their lives. And so I'm going to just now stop. So Phil, John, you guys want to respond or what you want to do?
Sure, we can give an initial response, but as John said earlier, we can open this up. Anyone really who wants to raise a hand and join the conversation. We want it to be mutual.
I wonder, Phil, if you want to just start off, though.
Yeah, I will.
Your thoughts and you know, a number of thoughts came to my mind as Jerry was.
Goodness gracious. Yeah, me too.
Please, why don't you start us off?
I will. Thank you, John. Yeah, I think you've given us a lot to ponder here, Jerry. I appreciate it very much. I was struck by the ethic ethos distinction that you made at the beginning. I sort of held on to that throughout the rest of what you were talking about. It got me thinking about how probably Genesis and beyond, I think we tend to read scripture as an ethical document rather than as something that guides us into ethos. So that's something I'm going to be.
That's well said. That's a great. We need to work with that because that's a great.
Yeah, I definitely. I'm gonna definitely chew on that for a bit. So I wonder. Something I wonder from you is, what is the place of ethic? Is there? I mean, there is a place for ethic, but does it flow out of a reoriented ethos? It's not an either or proposition, I suppose. I mean, at some point. We are, whether it's a rule of life or a system of some kind of policies or practices, we do take action and sort of talk about best action, but we just have to reorient the ground of which those actions spring forth from. Is that?
Yeah, and I think we also don't be naive about technology will save us, or
Right.
One of them that came clearly to me was when they succeeded in a positive fission a few months ago, and the promise of a perfectly clean energy was celebrated.
I think you mean fusion, Jerry.
Fusion, is that what I said?
You said fission.
No. I thought we do fusion and we did anyway.
No,
Whichever it
no, it's
is.
the other way around.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks. That what's missing from that is what we will do with the new discovery is basically what we did with fossil fuels. We will use it until it destroys everything around us. It without an ethos, no technology will be a solution,
Right.
and so on. Things like that.
Right. Yeah. So that definitely struck me. And the other thing, before you chime in, yours, John, one that stood out to me, I really loved the idea of Sabbath as the hero. That's a very new one. Or the idea of Sabbath being the pinnacle of creation. Like, it makes sense in the way that you laid it out, the Sabbath being the culmination of creation and not just sort of an afterthought, a breather on the bench afterwards, but actually like the pinnacle. I think that reorients a lot, both in terms of just practice and our own mindfulness of how we live into Sabbath, but also what I sort of heard you say in that is that almost if Sabbath, trust, contentment, rest, just abiding, if that is the pinnacle of creation, then ultimately the pinnacle of creation is just sort of your being itself. The beingness of things is the pinnacle, the thrust of what it's all about, versus the like this task or this outcome or this particular thing to strive for. But that, so like, and in that contemplative spirit, the idea that we sort of, when we abide, when we attend to, when we are just simply present in some way that is sort of a culmination of union with the divine, I just really, I think that's an interesting place to land, and something I had not ever thought about from the creation story before. So I thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
I had a couple of lines of thought, Jerry. And first of all, I'm grateful that you opened up some of the meaning of that image language, to be made in God's image. And it brought to mind, obviously we want to treat the book of Genesis in its own right, seriously, but we also, as Christians, want to look at the whole of Scripture, and Paul takes up that language, when he says that in Christ, in Colossians, says Christ is the image of the invisible God, and the Greek word there is icon. So in a way, you say icon is what you look through. You don't focus simply on the object. You look through it to the deeper reality. So ultimately, yes. I mean, I think that creation is itself iconic. That's why I think Robin titled his book "Living in an Icon," right? So I think I think the word ripples out, and as it assumes another language, it takes on other meanings as well. The second point that where you really got me thinking is when you refer to the first chapter as more of a hymn than anything else, and that seems to me right on target. And that whole opening sequence is, we might say, more of a celebration than an explanation. It has some elements of explanation of various things, but it certainly is a celebration, and it's related to the temple liturgy for sure, and to see the creation as God's temple is appropriate. So I think you're quite right on that. And if I could just take a moment to describe a little bit of a personal, a way that I felt the truth of this. Just a couple of weeks ago, I went to a concert in Nashville where the Nashville Symphony Chorus performed Haydn's great work called "The Creation," which uses a lot of text from precisely chapter 1 of Genesis mixed with some John Milton. I think what comes through there is that phrases like "let there be light." Wow, was that ever sung and celebrated? And Haydn shifts from pianissimo to double forte at that moment. The whole orchestra comes in, and you can feel people in the audience just responding to that. But particularly words that are liturgical, particularly God saw it and it was good. That, in literary terms, that's a refrain. It gets repeated and then it becomes very good. And that's so obvious to us, so familiar, that maybe we forget the force of it, that there is a holiness, a presence, and so forth reflected in that, so that the creation is, as you said, Jerry, full of God, full of goodness. It's as though we all need to be reminded of that several times within one chapter, lest we forget or fail to plumb the depths of what that very simple language suggests. I'll say one more word about the performance. The director of the Nashville choristers then said, and that Haydn's version ends, doesn't reach to the so-called fall, doesn't get into that, but it shows us the first parents, and he says, well, what was left to create was the fulfillment of love. And I thought, wow, for a choral director, that was a great insight. And it's a sense of the creation is not only good, it is the epitome of love. And I think that is, it took that choral performance to really bring that home to me. So it does come back to, that idea of the Sabbath, which I think the rabbinical writers are particularly eloquent in describing. The purpose of the Sabbath, and I think Yolande may want to talk a bit about that as well in the chat, but that the purpose of the Sabbath is not to recharge our batteries for the next work week. It reveals that the purpose of life itself is being and creation. And I guess my own question to myself and to the rest, I don't know what we as Christians do with the Sabbath. Because in truth, we don't have much of a Sabbath left, do we? We sort of think of some Sunday as a Sabbath, but we don't really treat it that way. My conservative and Orthodox Jewish friends certainly take Sabbath much more seriously than I do, and that I feel maybe I ought to do. I'm not sure what the celebration of Sabbath. Of course, we celebrate the Eucharist. We have our Sunday sense of the resurrection and transforming the Sabbath. I just a question I would raise. There are other questions others wish to raise. I don't know what honoring the Sabbath really should look like for Christians, particularly since the Sabbath, in a way, is the festival of creation, as I think you pointed us toward.
Yeah.
So let me stop there and see if others.
Yeah, that's a huge, and what I would want to say is Christians really celebrate the Sabbath the same way Jews should, and the other way around. It's, if you separate it from the cult, now you have an ethos question. So there is Sabbath keeping that's part of the cult. By cult, I mean, the worship life, the life of the temple, the religious community and their religious practice. I don't know how to say what was the intention of the celebration of Sabbath in Genesis 1, but I do think that Genesis from there goes on to illustrate the violation of Sabbath in the murder of Cain, the murder of Abel, in the building of the Tower of Babel, in we were blessed to fill the earth, but we were not blessed to overtake it. And the law, all the plowing to the edge rows, the gleaning twice, building house to house and field to field till there's no longer room for you in the midst of the earth, that indictment from the prophets, are all violations of Sabbath. So it's far more, I don't know, I want to say more. It is as much about justice and economics outside of the cult as it is a day of practice. The reason for the practice is to live it out elsewhere, and sort of Sabbath, there is a way to do it. I see Brueggemann. Sabbath is a resistance. There is a justice element. That's what I mean by when Sabbath is not just taken, it is given. You give it to your farm animals at the expense of not working. And that's where it becomes
Mhm.
an economic issue, right?
Mhm.
You give it to your servants and your slaves, and you give it to the stranger, to no benefit to yourself.
Mhm.
I think is partly the point. Um, anyway, that so yes, that Sabbath keeping is a hugely ecological
Mhm.
tenet.
Mhm.
What is the earth for, or what's a person for? Wendell Berry asks, what are people for? Are
Sure.
they for work, or are they for the givenness
Right.
of creation? And that's why to me it's a pinnacle. Um, we are not meant to be the brickmakers for Pharaoh. That is not why we were created. We were created, and everything else was, for the enjoyment of God, which is not
Mhm.
necessarily leisure.
Right.
It is givenness. It's contentment. It's mutual care. There's enough. It's a statement of enough, right? Sabbath is an expression of enough,
Mhm.
which is
I,
where the Christian church just does not want to go.
I think I think Dave
Let's go
Souty had
ahead
his
with some
hand up.
words.
Yeah,
Dave
was there a hand?
Souty.
Oh, there
Yep.
we are, Dave.
Dave.
Hi, I'm just bouncing. This is so exciting and we don't have enough time and I want to go on retreat. Um, but I want to start with what is this image that we bear? And what I'm getting from you, Jerry, is this God from the beginning is just selflessly outpouring. Let there be, let there be, let there be.
Mhm.
And that has immense diversity and creativity and imagination, which is key, I think. And then in that selfless giving and imagination, there's delight. And then it culminates in this Sabbath. And so this suggests to me that Sabbath is maybe this omega point, or it's this purpose of ultimate being and being in relationship, but it's the invitation to reorient, not back to work, but reorient to participating in selfless giving, imagining, and delighting in God, one another, creation. And then you just want to go on and on and on, and life is full. There's no shortage or abundance or competition. It's a different pattern, I think. And thank you for laying that out. That's what I got.
Yeah.
Imagining and delighting. Great words, Dave. Thank you for suggesting that. I think Robin, Robin, you and Heather, did you have some comments about Sabbath as well?
There were sure. I've just been pondering a little bit. Well, first of all, the whole notion of the sovereignty of God, that God makes everything go. We don't make everything go. And so God rests because God's in charge of everything, doesn't have to worry about it. And so this recognition of God as sovereign, that we're not the ones dominating, God is in charge. And then to Dave's point, well, how is God in charge? And then that gets us into the image of God idea. But I've been pondering, I'm just reading Brueggemann's book on the Psalms, praying the Psalms.
Mm.
And he makes a point that there are basically two kinds of Psalms. The Psalms when you're totally dislocated, where you're being overtaken, you're in the swamp, sort of thing. And the other where it's the Psalm of celebration of God's greatness. And a lot of those Psalms talk about God as creator. So it struck me that in some ways, this hymn in Genesis, and I like the point that it's a hymn, is also a psalm in which it celebrates God's mastery of all things. And when we remember that this was written, as I understand, while the Jewish people were in Babylon, it totally dislocated, and wondering, typically God's God over a particular place. They're out of Jerusalem. They're out of Israel. So is my God here at all? and this celebration that God is the creator of all things, and God is the master over the gods of chaos of Babylon. So really what this hymn is about is God, and God, and how God is master of all things. And then the Sabbath is our recognition of that mastery. So it seems to me that's something to ponder. And then the last point, I also was struck that if God is at rest, because God has everything moving just fine, then that leads us into the whole notion of wisdom, starting to understand how is it that God works in this. And I, as bearing God's image, I need to learn to cooperate with the way God has already made things to be. So I don't go in and alter things just as I wish and mess things up. I'm going to serve as God serves, working with this mutuality that Jerry so well talked about. I'm working within this system. And to me, that has enormous implications for the way we interface with the world around us. So, and, of course, my JAG is green design, but to me, that really mirrors this whole notion of mutuality, of respect, of delight in things. So that's, I guess, those thoughts came to mind.
Yolande has her hand up.
Please go ahead, Yolande.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say, we use, this Genesis reading as a first reading every year at the Easter Vigil. I'm sure many of you do too. And on the one hand, I love it. I love to read it when I have that privilege. But the what you said, Jerry, about it being a hymn, a poem, about being music, really resonated with me in that, because on the one hand, I think, oh, this could be very boring because it's so repetitive and everybody knows what it says. But to me, it never is. And so it just makes sense that it's a hymn or a poem, because you don't get bored with those things.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, I think of how great they are. Whatever our favorite hymns are that we sing and that resonate and can bring us to tears, if we could in some ways feel that about Genesis 1,
Mhm.
that would be great. Yeah.
Other comments? Anyone else?
Robin has called out something in the chat. I want to
Hmm.
say yay to, of course. She's referring to a Province 4 and 5, of which you guys are Province 4, Creation Care Retreat near Louisville, the first weekend in May, and John Lean from Dio, Western Massachusetts, I guess, a priest there, is going to join me, and we're going to do Genesis for 4 hours on that Saturday morning. And among the other things we're doing in the retreat, but that's the Saturday morning stretch. So go to the Province 5. I had to drop that. I might drop that in the chat. For registration is still open. We're at the Sisters of Nazareth Retreat Center in Nazareth, Kentucky. It is Derby weekend, which is why it was easy to get the retreat center. But I'll drop that in the chat. Go ahead, Phil. I'll proceed.
Want to be sure others have time to raise their hand or just add a comment or ask a question if you have one. Anything you're thinking about. Jerry, do you have, as folks are pondering, do you have any sort of thoughts about, some of what we're exploring here, the way we're engaging, thinking of Genesis as poetry or hymnody, reimagining or reclaiming the sense of dominion? These are things that, for many folks, that we might encounter elsewhere in our life, it would meet some puzzlement, at least, if not resistance. Do you have any thoughts about sort of like, for those of us for whom this really resonates, like how do we engage this in our faith communities or elsewhere? Where might we start to have these conversations?
Yeah, no kidding. And for many Christians, actually, they'll dismiss all of this out of hand for that one maligned text. I think it's what we've been talking about, that the more I get in groups and the more that question gets raised almost every time when you're doing a thing, right? It'll probably get raised. I'm sure it'll get raised in May at Nazareth when we're there. And is to say, all right, the day is done for us running away from this text. We need to move toward it and claim it. And the claim is that, okay, in our tradition anyway, we have been named as those who are to image God in the domain of the world. Okay, how are we doing with that? If you want to claim your dominion, all right, go ahead. Have dominion like God does. How are you doing with that? Is everything blessed and how is the be fruitful and multiplied going? How is the giving of all of food to every creature going? How are you doing with that? It actually is an indicting text to us. It is not permission. It's an indictment. That, in fact, we can lean into it as, if you want to use that text, and then don't conflate it with chapter 2 in Genesis, but set it side by side with, we were put here to till and keep. That is our real kind of purpose for being. If you want to lean into the texts that inform our faith, that's what that text does. It tells us, why are we here? We are here to till and keep. We are here to image God on the domain of the earth. Let's do that. I'm all for it. And so what I'm starting to do is call it up as a virtue, not as a problem. I guess. I don't know. Does that work for anybody?
No.
Our image of God is faulty. Of course it is. And even, Eve's reaching for the tree of knowledge was a violation of Sabbath. Now, you don't want to conflate those two stories necessarily either. You want to set them side by side. But that was an act of discontentment. It was a rejection of God's rest. It was a violation. It was a reversal of that we are to be the source of blessing and keeping. Rather, we wanted to become the takers. It was a rejection of the mandate given to us. All of that has economic and political and social implications. That I guess we need to go down that road.
Yolanda asked in chat, how can we reclaim Sabbath on our Sundays? Rather practice-based question.
You mean as a society or as churches? As religious communities? I mean, we're not, I don't know. We have far more problems, bigger problems of the violation of Sabbath than blue laws. I lament the loss of blue laws, but they did not keep us from being violators of Sabbath. So I don't know. That's a big question, Yolanda, about for whom and what groups and in what ways, because we can do it in small communities, I suppose, if we should so choose. Anyway, I'll stop.
I'm wondering, Heather, are you still here? You wrote in the chat, about keeping the Sabbath holy, maybe to follow on Jerry's point, if you're still there, I wonder if you have some thoughts about that. How might we keep it holy? You want to address that?
And I see your name.
It's a tough question, I
Yes,
know.
let me unmute.
Go ahead, Heather.
Here, hold on.
Oh,
There we go.
Hey, yay.
There.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
It's broken up a little bit, but give it a shot.
Okay, yep, I think it's right. Well, I think holiness is,
Whether you might
I
actually.
think holiness is going to look different for. Do we not, is it not,
cut your
not working?
video. If you cut your video, that your audio might work better. Your video takes up bandwidth. So there you go. Try.
Okay, are we good now? Maybe sound better?
Better sound. Yep.
Okay. Well, I think that holiness is going to look in retaining the Sabbath as a holy perception on that day. I think it's going to look different for different groups of people. I work in the social services, drug court, addiction sort of area. And for someone who, at least in our society, is struggling to pay bills and has to work and maybe doesn't get a physical rest from a job, we have to encourage Sabbath to be cultivated and found in other ways. I think people who struggle with, caretaking of elderly, or don't have what we consider, a break from duties and obligations, Sabbath for them is going to look different. People who have time to spare and are not working any longer, or children are grown and out of the house, Sabbath is going to look as a holy event different for them. I think the goal for entrusting it to be still a very sovereign and experience, worshiping in whichever way will glorify God for us. We'll be looking at those kind of outside influences that in our culture that keep us from doing that, whether it's economics or it's pressure to conform to some standard, or materialism or consumerism. Like all of that just wears and bears down on how you and your own family or your own people group can keep it holy. So I don't think there's a one model for everybody. It's going to look unique and it's going to look different, but the goal is to keep that relationship and that sort of rawness and awareness of God as the forefront. I don't know, blabbing.
no,
Thank you.
I think that's a great comment, Heather. Thank you. Practically speaking, yes, so many people have different lived realities. And if, as you said, Jerry, if the purpose of Sabbath to some extent is the sort of trust and contentment, abiding presence, the sacredness of being itself, that's something that we can discern how to cultivate as individuals in varied circumstances, even if we don't have Sundays off, quote unquote. And that it's less about leisure and more about the sort of integrity and wholeness of being, however we can find it and however we can advocate for it on behalf of people who maybe have limited access or limited sort of honoring of the own integrity of their being. And I would add non-human creation to that conversation too. Bart, I think your hand was raised for a while.
Thanks, Phil. It's like CCC all over. I appreciate what all of you had to say, and very much. And I just wanted, something occurred to me and we've had these discussions in CCC, and the whole dominion issue. It just occurs to me that, or my sense of it is that it's something that seems to be very male dominated in nature. post-Constantine? And how much, my question is then, how much is this associated directly with the stance the church took post-Constantine regarding male power and authority? Power over rather than power, shared power, especially power over not only all the creatures, but also over women. And I'm channeling to some extent.
Genesis is a great book for that, because what will happen is Israel will go on and it will become wrapped up in kings and before the kings, I forgot, the judges and the military leaders, and the conversation with Solomon and his concubines and his slaves, and David and his desire for, the constant struggle between God and Israel about temples and about slavery and about kingship is, I think, this very debate about Sabbath keeping. That it's the struggle between wanting to secure ourselves and wanting to live securely in God. That debate, to me, is the essence of the Sabbath debate. Does that get at?
Yeah, and I was really looking at the whole power structure of the church, and taking on seems to me a predominantly male role, male power role after Constantine, after associating itself with the power structure.
I mean, I do think patriarchy is enmeshed in some of the narratives of Scripture itself, even pre-Constantine. I mean, I think we have to reckon with the patriarchy that shows up in the texts as its own thing. But I think in terms of empire, like, and this reminds me of Heather's earlier comment about resistance, Sabbath is resistance, and Brueggemann, are we coming at this from a paradigm of empire, of exploitation, both of people and other aspects of creation, or are we trying to get underneath that and understand what it means to stand in solidarity with in our God-given role?